Hey there guys, how's it going? In this session we're going to be finishing off our game. In the previous one we looked at points 2 and 3, so we effectively allowed our user to establish a random number between 2 points. So in this code here, in my main function, we called the establish random number function, passing in low and high. This then created a random number which was defined here, and that was the point where we finished the previous video. So in this session, we're going to be doing points 4, 5 and 6. The actual gameplay loop itself is fairly straightforward, but 5 and 6 are a little bit larger, but I always find it funny how the main point of the game, in this case, its main loop, this is probably the most simplest. Points 2 and 3 are arguably a little bit more complex. Well, point 2 anyway. So just before we get started, I want to just let you know, in the description there's a link to my Python Udemy course for beginners. It's about 16 and a half hours, there's 25 coding exercises, 20 assignments, there's a hell of a lot of material, and that's free for the next few months. It's normally £40. It's at about 170 sales so far, so if you fancy learning Python for free, feel free to check that out, that'll be awesome. So, first things first, I want to quickly run the game, show you where we're up to, and then we're going to be coding up and finishing this game off today. So, I hit run, let's make a bit of space up here. So this first asks me for my name, which is this line almost here. So if I go ahead and do James, like this. Next thing that happens, it then asks me for the low and high point. So this is this function being called here. So if I scroll upwards a little bit, I'm being asked for my lowest and my highest. So say I do 1, my highest being 100. And then that's where we left it at the last point here. So what basically happened there, we established these two variables. Those two variables were then passed to this function, which is really simple, but it's really important. That creates the random number. That random number is then passed down to here, and now we're ready to take this random number, pass it into a main gameplay loop, and then we can actually play higher and lower. So I'm going to do this down here. So I'm going to quickly write, let's see, I think what we'll do a little function, and we'll say pass the random number to main gameplay func, like this here. Okay, and what we want to do is I'm going to define the variable and the function call first, then go back and then create the function. So I'm going to say the score, and this will all be obvious in just a second why I've done this, is equal to main gameplay of random number. So I'm passing main gameplay to, I'm passing main gameplay the variable random number. So random number is defined here, we're then using that and passing it into this function here. So what I want to do is now make a bit of space here. Then I'm going to write def main gameplay random number, and I'm just going to make a bit of space there for a second so it doesn't crash. So what I'm basically doing is saying set those lower upper numbers up, use those to make the random number. That random number then gets passed to this function. So ideally what I want to happen now is this main gameplay function, I want this to then return a score, so that score we create can then be used to create our save file. So these two functions here. So that will all be done once the game is all finished, and our player has correctly guessed that number at the end. So for our main gameplay function, make a bit of space here for a second, this is going to return an integer, so being the number of guesses. So and I can do a simple docstring for this as well. I'll keep it simple for the time being. I'll just do main gameplay loop here. I've definitely got to put a capital letter on that one. So this is going to be fairly straightforward. So just to run you through kind of from a pseudocode point of view, we're first going to ask the user to make a guess. And then we're also going to set up a variable to keep track of how many attempts they've had. We're then going to enter into a loop, which actually does the higher or lower logic of the game, so to speak. So I say guess is equal to int input. I'm just going to write take a guess for this here. I then want to set up a variable to keep track of how many times they've done this. So in this case, we'll set it equal to 1, implying that once this line is done, that is a single guess that has happened here. Okay. Now this is where it gets interesting, and I would argue the main kind of meat of the game really is there's going to be a while loop, which basically says while they have incorrectly guessed the number, keep going. So if I do while the guess they've done is not equal to the random number, which don't forget we passed in here, then we can enter the loop and do some logic. So if I do the else at the same time, of course the else is only going to happen when this condition is not satisfied. So for the loop to happen, the guess has to be different to the random number because we want them to guess again in here. But if the guess is the same as the random number, we come to the else and we do something here. And we can just say correct, and then let's return the number of attempts. So if you envision what happens, they're going to do a number of guesses to try and get it correct. Eventually they'll get it correct, so they'll see this. Let's do a little new line symbol there as well. And we will turn the number of attempts. Therefore, that number of attempts is going to be passed down here into this score section. So, to finish off our while loop, it's going to be really quite straightforward. So we'll say for every time we enter into the loop, we'll increase the number of attempts by 1. And then what we'll do is, to obviously pinpoint that the higher or lower bit, we'll say if their guess was greater than the random number, and then what we can actually do then is steal this and just change the prompt. So of course, say the random number is 5 and they've guessed 10. So they've guessed, in this case, they've guessed greater for the random number. Let's just do something here and say, I'll say guess lower, like that. Leave some spaces. Of course, we could do it, and then just flip the whole thing around then. Actually, what you could do, if you want to be super lazy, just do that, and then just flip it around. So if they guess lower for the random number, of course, same variable, same setup, just change the prompt to say guess higher, like this here. Okay, and that's it. That is the main bulk of our higher and lower game. What I want to do is, let's come back down here for a second. We can do a little bit of a prompt down here to say, you took X attempts to guess number Y, for example. So we'll do a quick F string. So we'll say you took blank, in this case, score attempts. So because if you envision that this is returning the number of attempts they took. They took this many attempts to guess, and in this case here, this is going to be a random number. So it's a nice kind of visual prompt. So once they're finished, we're good to go. So just to test this, let's say we enter a name of James, 10 being my highest. So this is my first guess. So I've guessed 2, third guess, there we go. I took 3 attempts to guess 7. So that's pretty good. Arguably, I think especially if you're a new programmer, you could definitely beef this up. You could put some nice validation on here. You could build a system so they can't they can't guess the same number twice, and so on and so forth. So if you're starting off in Python, I'd definitely recommend beefing this up and try and make it a bit more robust, especially for this section here, because you could feasibly break this by passing in an invalid input and crashing this integer function. So far so good then. Our main gameplay is done. I'm going to flick back here for a second, and we're now going to look at building these 2 files, or functions I should say, which do the file. So if I go back to my code, this is this section here. So we have a text file which says player X took this many guesses given a choice of X numbers, whatever, and here's the date. So we're going to build the function which does that logic now. So let's see where we're going to be doing that. Obviously down here in this case. And this is going to be done, I'm going to do these kind of both at the same time, and I think arguably you could put these in the same function, but if we're going with the single responsibility principle, I want to have one job per function. So this one creates the text, this one takes that text and sticks it in a text file. That's it. Just keeps it, in my view, I'd say a fair bit easier. So we can define a variable called file text, and this is going to be equal to whatever a function returns called create, I'll do create save file text. And of course, to create the text for the file, we need the information, from the user. So we need their name, we're going to need the score, we're going to need low, and we're going to need high. So that's all the information we need to generate that file there. So if I do a quick comment, let's say user info to create save file text like this. Now I can steal this, come back upstairs, def, create this, and let's just do a quick doc string here. Create text for the save file. And what this is going to be is basically a really big kind of template string, and this template string is going to be defined inside the function and then populated by passing in these different things here. Now you may have noticed that the date and time was in this one, so we want to basically capture the date and time as of when this function was called. So that's done in, well, quite a simple way to this really. If I come back up here, I'm going to do my imports alphabetically. So if I do, say, from datetime, so this is using the datetime module to call. I'm going to do this. From datetime, import datetime, just like that. And then inside the function here, I'm going to use a method which basically does it in 2 bits. You can't just put the date time in like this here. What I want to do is first get the current date and time as a datetime object, and then convert that datetime into a string. We have to make sure that this returns a string here. And speaking of which, we should probably put a type in for that here as well, str. So what we do this in a few bits. We do now is equal to datetime.now, like this. So this gets the date time object. Now you couldn't just put that into a file, you need to make it into a string. And also if you output this, it outputs it with all the decimal numbers for the milliseconds, which is I would argue not particularly nice. So what we can do is say format this into a nice string, and the way of doing that is to do datetime.strftime. That stands for string formatted time, and we can see that this takes 2 things. It takes in datetime here, which has to be the datetime object. It then takes in the format, and that's the string we want. And what we can do, for example, you could just steal this here. In fact, I will, and I'm then going to convert it. So let's check that copies. It does. So it's, yeah, and I always feel like with these codes, they're a bit of a pain to learn initially, especially when there's a lowercase m for the month, an uppercase 1 for the minute, and so on and so forth. So we'll keep this to one side for a second, and then we'll modify it a little bit for what we need. So we'll pass in now here. And then we'll do actually I won't do format equals. I'll just pass it, or I will. I'll do it properly. There we go. So if I do it like this, this is saying day, month, year. In this case here, see mine's backwards. So in this case here, this will be slightly different. So what I'm going to do, let's see. I'm going to put the time at the front. So I'm going to take this section here for hour, minute, second. And then what I'm going to do, see how I've done this here. I've done 6th of April 2023. The only difference I need to do for that is if I switch out this M for month, this will do it numerically, but if you do a capital B like that instead, that actually switches it out for this here, so that'll create like April instead, which is a bit nicer. And then I think what I'll do is separate these with dashes instead. I just think it looks a little bit nicer. Make sure I get this correct. Well, no, that's a VS Code doing that red, but yeah, not to worry. So that's saying, first of all, get the current date and time in this datetime object, and then using strftime, convert it into a string of this format. So hour, minute, second, space, day, and then the month name in that format, in like text format, followed by the year as well. So 2023 in this case. So what we're going to do now is build up the big template string, and this will just be a part of it. Of course, everything else is already here and good to go. So I'm going to do score string is equal to, and then I'm going to do player blank, let's see, took blank guesses, say given a choice of, make sure I spell it all correctly, blank numbers. Now, of course, this is just completely made up by myself. Of course, you could do any kind of format you want here, but I want to go with this. See what you want. And because we're writing to file, make sure you do -n, because we're going to be opening the file in a pen mode. You want to make sure that when you're writing new content, it's writing on a new line. So just something to be aware of there. Then we do .format. So this is a string method format, which basically says, given these little spots here, fill them with something. So in this case, we're going to be doing player name, took score guesses, given a choice of, and then we'll do a bit of maths with this here. And before I forget, what you want to do is I'm going to do a couple of dashes here, do this here, and my date and time is going to go there. So to avoid doing this all on a big gigantic line, hit enter here, and we're going to pass in our data kind of one by one. Starting off with name, we'll do name.title, then we'll do score next. So player name took score guesses, that's the number of attempts here. This bit here, because obviously so say the low and the high point, say it was 1 and 10, If you just did 10 Tokyo 1, you'd only get 9 numbers. So what you need to do is, in this case here, I would do high minus low plus 1 here, just to account for that additional number. And then finally, formatted now, like this. I'm pretty happy with that. The only thing I'm missing, which is just purely just me, I like to put these little type-ins here as well, just to tell me which, name is a string, score is an int, low should be an integer. Now, what else have we got? The high should also be an integer as well. And I would argue that that's pretty good. All that's left now is just to return this score string. And we're good to go. So now we just need to come down to the bottom here. I'm just going to quickly test this. I could do both, both functions in one go. I just want to just quickly check that this looks okay. So we'll make this nice and big. Let's clear the terminal and hit run. Let's say Matthew. Let's do lowest 1, highest 5. Okay, gonna guess 1. Oh, well, that was good. One guess. There we go. Player Matthew took 1 guesses, given a choice of 5 numbers, date and time. Awesome. I'm pretty happy with that. It's a nice simple string which we can then write to file. So, given that we've got a string, all we're going to do now is just, the last bit is create the function to actually write this. So this will be the only function we write which doesn't return anything. So we're going to do write text to file and simply take file text, pass this in here, and then we're good to go. I'm going to quickly comment this as well. Finally, write this to file. There we are, just like that. Okay, so time to steal this. So make sure I copy and paste it. And then we can then come ahead and define that function here. File text is a string. This function doesn't return anything, so we can go ahead and just do none to indicate that up here. And then let's just say write gameplay text to file. And then we are good to go. Now with these files here, you can open files in Python in a number of different modes. The default is read-only. We're going to write it in what's called append mode. That means that if the file doesn't exist, Python will create it for you. If the file already exists, it will add content to the end of that file, basically. Just be really careful with certain modes. If you do it in W mode, it will nuke the file and create it from scratch. You definitely don't want to do this with your dissertation in the same directory, which would be very, very unfortunate. And we can do this over 2 lines. We're going to use with open. I'll explain why in just a second. I'll just explain what arguments we're going to be using. So we're going to say with open, and in this case here, I'm actually missing an argument. I'm missing the file name, which, as you might recall, has been lurking since the start of this video, but hasn't come to fruition yet. There it is. So we actually passed file name in down here, so that's my bad for missing out. With open, file name, mode equals A, and let's just say we're going to open it as file. Now, I've opened it using with open. You could do like file equals open this, file.write, file.close. The difficulty of that is that you have to explicitly close the file. When you do this here, we're opening the file in what's called a context. So we're saying with this file open, then we have some indentation. Once all the indented code has finished, Python automatically shuts the file for you, and it just looks better. It saves lines, it saves code. And if someone's looking at it from afar, they can say, okay, the file has been opened here, these lines were doing some stuff, and then boom, it's closed automatically and we're good to go. And all we're going to do is just say, with the file open in the append node, file.write, file text. There we go. What I'll do, I'm going to go ahead and kill this scores.txt file. There we go, come back to main, and we're going to test this all the way from the start. I just need to make sure that I pass file name into here. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit, just to make sure I've got a bit of space, and give it a go. Fingers crossed everything works first time. So let's say let's go highest as 20. I'm going to guess 10. I'm going to guess 15, 13, 12, probably 11. Wait, here we go. 5 attempts to guess 11. Cool. So, hey, it's happened. Scores.txt. Nice. There we are. So, because we open this in append mode, I'm going to quickly run through this again. Really quickly. Let's say I'm going to guess 1, 2, 3, 4. There we are. Now, because it's in the pen mode, we can see Matthew's score, 4 guesses, given a choice of 5 numbers, date and time. There we go. And that's it. That's our higher and lower game written from scratch. If you made it this far, thanks very much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to make sure this code is available in the description, so I'll link this to my GitHub page. Of course, as well, if this has been useful for you for whatever reason, feel free to like and subscribe. That'll be awesome. And what we're going to do is just a quick breeze through from top to bottom. I'm going to finish off with one small bit of code at the end as well. So from the top, we've imported 2 modules. These are both built in. Date time to produce these guys here, current date and time. We also introduced random to make our random number. And the first function we start working on is our main function here. The first thing this function does, it uses the input function to say, please enter your name. If nothing is entered, so of course this statement then returns true, therefore we print this, function returns, the game's over, that's it. Suppose our users behave themselves, we then set up the low and high numbers by calling retrieve lower upper numbers, which is basically a big while loop with some validation. And if the get all is correct, we return the numbers they've selected. And so say they enter 1 and 100, we return 1 and 100. Given that those two things return, say 1 and 100, the 1 and 100 will then be passed to this guy here, establish random number. That takes those two numbers, lowest and highest, and returns a random number between those 2 points, so any number between 1 and 100. Once that's done, we then created our main gameplay loop here, which even though this is the bulk of the game, is fairly straightforward. Simply uses user input and a variable, and a while loop which says, while their guess is not the right number, bump up the number of attempts, and if they've guessed higher, tell them say, oh, print lower. If they've guessed below the random number, tell them to print higher. Once they get it correct, we tell them so, and we return that number of attempts. And from that point onwards, we then create our save file text, and that's done by basically creating a really big template string and populating that using their name, the number of guesses, how many numbers they have to choose from, and of course our date and time, which we did earlier as well. That was then passed down to here to then write that to file. So all that's left to do, I'm going to make sure I've got my functions spaced out. I always like to do 2 spaces between functions. In this case I have. That all looks good. Now the only thing we're going to be putting in here is a quick, and you might see this in a lot of larger programs, is a little variable called if name. I'll explain this. I think this is arguably one of the most confusing little things that beginners tend to learn. If name is equal to main here. And quickly what this does, this special variable name here, now whenever you run a Python script, any Python script will have this name variable here. And if you directly run this file, so if I'm in main.py and I click run, then what this does, this takes on a value of dunder main, like this here. If I was to import this file elsewhere, it would take on the name of that file. So say this file was called hello123.py and I imported it elsewhere, this would be set to hello123, etc. So basically, if this code was imported, this wouldn't run anymore. If you have this file open directly and you were in here and you were hitting run, then it will run directly. So it's a good indication to basically say, this is the main entry point or the main way of operating this program, and that's it. Cheers for watching, guys. I hope you'll have a great weekend, and I'll see you soon.